Good afternoon. We're so pleased to have you with us today for our November Vanguard Virtual Series. We're especially honored to welcome Susan McIntyre as our presenter today. Before I introduce Sue, let me greet each of you. Although we're not able to see you on screen, we're pleased to have over 70 attendees for today's presentation. As always, with an audience this size, we'll utilize the webinar format for our presentation today. Susan encourages your questions and will provide the opportunity for you to participate through the chat feature or by raising your virtual hand later in the program. Susan is a mother, author, and humanitarian who pushed herself outside her comfort zone to embrace love over hate after the horrific attack on 9/11. Susan began her international work after raising her 3 children and having a successful career as a physical therapist. In 2002, Sue traveled to Afghanistan as the U.S. government's team leader in disaster response. Her journey leads her to a world that challenges her own internal turmoil as she encounters warlords known as butchers, village elders who will not sit with her, all while providing life-saving assistance to Afghan civilians caught in war. Susan has 30 years of international experience, including 20 years with the U.S. government specializing in disaster relief. She has a bachelor's degree from Boston University and a master's of education from UNCG. She's now retired and living in Washington, North Carolina. See, with that introduction, we are thrilled to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon too to everyone. Thank you for taking your time to join with me this afternoon and hear a little bit about my experiences. I'm so pleased to be able to share what I experienced when I was in Afghanistan, because I really want to bring it home as much as possible to people. Let us start with the slides. I have a slide presentation, and it's just to cue me more than anything, but it's there as a visual too. So I've written the book, and it's called Outside Heaven, an Afghanistan Experience. A little kind of disclaimer type thing. The Outside Heaven title comes from the fact that the American embassies, we always have code names when we're outside of in hostile areas, and heaven was the code name for the embassy. So you get that very early in the book, so I don't think it's a spoiler at all. But that's where the title comes from, because it's a lot of my experiences outside of what the embassy experience was into Afghanistan. Next slide. So just a little bit, she's already introduced you to me, a little bit about who I am and how I got to go to Afghanistan. As she said, I did graduate from Boston University, and my first career really was in physical therapy. And I worked in physical therapy for a number of years. Now, the way I made the jump from doing physical therapy work into international work was actually back in the very beginning of the 90s. In 1989, Armenia had a very bad earthquake. And through the need for external physical therapists to come in to treat the damaged and injured people from the earthquake, that was my first step into the international arena. And I was a sucker after that. I was gone, loved it. And my husband joined me over there, and he did some work on his own through a different kind of experience in hospital administration. And we ended up providing medical services for the Armenians that were damaged by the earthquake. So that kind of was my jumping off stone. And it's a long and convoluted history that led to my writing this book. But after doing 10 years of international direct services in disaster relief, I felt like I needed to get on the government side and on the donor side so I could help influence the decision making about what got funded and what didn't. Okay, next slide. That's the cover of my book. And if you have not gotten it, I would be very pleased if you do, and you'll get more information about that later at the end of the program. But that's the cover. Next slide. Okay, why did I write this book? I have to be honest, the first thing was because I wanted to witness really to a time and a place that was unique, as I say. Um, you know, as the years went by after 2002, I began to realize how different things were being either portrayed or experienced in Afghanistan when I heard from colleagues that were there in the years after I was. I realized it was very, very different. I thought I had a unique perspective that I wanted to share with the world about how the Afghans were when we came in. They didn't know who we were. Most people didn't know where America was, to tell you the truth, when we worked certainly with the village people. So it was really interesting for me, as I kept watching the changing, that I wanted to bring forth that information. And then I wrote the book also because it was in response to my son being caught in the World Trade Towers on 9/11. He was on the 89th floor. He did survive. It's an amazing story of his survival and how he got down from the 89th floor of the towers. And I bring that into the book because it was the impetus for really pushing me over to going to Afghanistan. But it's not a story about him per se, but he's an integral part of the beginning, certainly. I wanted to give my family a history of some of my activities. And my grandchildren were very little, and they kind of don't know where their grandma goes all the time. And the simple answer was, oh, grandma goes to help feed hungry children, and that satisfied. But as they're beginning to get into their teen years and into the young adulthood, I thought I really wanted them to know a little bit about who I am, but what the work was that I was doing. And then the other thing was that I wanted to discuss some of the stresses and struggles that I was having as a foreign aid worker, but also I knew and I have learned through the years, it's a very common for a lot of humanitarians to go through a lot of the PTSD that, and people tend to associate post-traumatic stress disorder and traumas to the military. But so many of us that work in the field in humanitarian work are in the same environment. And all of my last sort of 15 years of work, basically, I've been in war zones, probably more war zones than a lot of the military because they rotate through regions and they don't go to them all. I seem to have hit a lot of the major wars. And there's so much stress into recognize that that also is something that the humanitarians come back with. And it wouldn't just be for me working with the government. There's so many young people that are out there doing humanitarian work directly with the victims or the civilians caught in the war that I felt like it was really important to kind of at least acknowledge mine and talk about what I was going through. So that was another reason why I decided to write the book. Okay, next slide. So I kind of did just prepare you for how we're going to proceed and where we're going. I'm kind of dividing today into 3 sections. I want to talk to you a little bit about the people that I met and I worked with. Amazing people, and I will get into that. And then I want to talk a little bit about the recipients of the programs and who they were. Then I want to tell you a little bit about the programs that we developed and offered to those in need. The logistical challenges is very hard for people who have never been either overseas in a third world country and overlay that with overseas a third world country at war. And the logistics of getting goods and services to the civilians is really challenging. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of programs and what we did. And then lastly, again, I'll struggle a little. I will talk a little bit about my struggles as I left my family and friends to work and live in Afghanistan. Next slide. Okay, so who are those people? What people am I talking about? The people that I came in contact were in 2 categories. We have the colleagues that we work with. Now, in any embassy anywhere in the world, we have what we call local employees. Those folks are the ones that obviously could speak English. So we were finding folks in Afghanistan, even in 2002, after all the years of either the Russian control or the Taliban control, we did have English speakers there. They usually are the younger people. Here, they usually were more of a middle age because they were people that had gone to school prior to the Taliban taking over. But we were able to find a number of really good people to come in and work in the embassy. As a side note, when they work in the embassy, they're very restricted. In any country, the local staff is very restricted where they can go in the embassy because we have secured areas where we have classified information. But we have them do a lot of the office work. We have them do certainly a lot of our interface with the local Afghans and the local communities. So we had both our office workers inside the embassy. Then we also hired specialists for the program activities that could advise me on like what's appropriate here. And also, I'm not an engineer, and so we did engineering things, or I'm not a water specialist. And when we did water, so we had engineers, we had business owners, we had medical staff that provided direct services that we funded. So those are the folks that came in that worked with us. We also then, of course, had the government officials in any country. So my government officials in Kabul, and I speak in the book about it. And my primary interlocutor was Ashraf Ghani, who you will know now was the infamous president that just ran away from Afghanistan as it was falling and ran out of the country, which I find rather ironic for a lot of reasons. I speak about him in the book and about my meetings with him, and that I had weekly meetings with him, both in general meetings, also some meetings in his home. Then there are also the most special people, which are the Afghans in the villages, who are usually the recipients of our programs. They are the heart and feeling of all of my programs. I love meeting with them, and they are the people that very often get missed by a number of the other folks that work in international work. Because if you're not working in the humanitarian work, if they're in the embassy work and they're the political advisors, or they're doing the direct government work and the politics of all of that, they're working with all the officials. I'm the one that really walks out into the village and really touches the people of Afghanistan. So they are the other groups. Then included in the with that, we had the warlords in this case. And I had either the privilege or not, I'm not sure how we rank it, to meet with a number of the warlords up in the mountains. And as I was meeting with them, I was almost always with either the ambassador. I actually didn't do work alongside our military. And I talk a little bit about that a little bit later, because there's a conflict between the military has a very different agenda. While we both are there representing America, and we both technically have the same boss, who would be all the way up to the president. I actually was working as a neutral party in the country, whereas obviously the military has an agenda. But as I would work going to meet the warlords, I would sometimes have to have protection. Usually I tried to get the civilian American protection that is provided within the embassy. But if not, I would have to go with military escort. And as I said, it's most important with the recipients of the programs, those most in need and most vulnerable. Okay, next slide. Okay, so some of the programs that we support civilians caught in war. If you just think in your mind about like when you see in America, or if you've been caught in hurricanes, or you've been caught in some of the weather disasters that we have here in the States, you begin to realize how you can become very vulnerable very quickly. And you have needs that have to be met. And the most primary needs certainly are in terms of water needs. They cannot wait. Those are things that are very critical. Some of the health needs, whether it's the chronic illnesses that need to be addressed, or the, childbirthing, it happens. Everybody knows it happens. It doesn't matter what's going on outside. So we did a lot in terms of both well child checkups and vaccinations for newborns, but also a lot of work with pre and postnatal care. And that was a big part. Then the nutritional support for ongoing things that we needed to bring the nutrients for, again, children, for the women, for the elderly. One of the things with all of the programs I want to talk about, including the like emergency shelter, and NFI stands for non-food items, non-food items. all of our programs are geared towards the civilians. I bring no assistance whatsoever to any military, any militia, or any of the fighters on any side of any conflict, no matter where I am in the world. Having said that, what we try to do is when we give assistance, we try to make sure things don't have what we call a dual use. So that means that I'm not going to give something that could be taken out of the home of a civilian and used for activities of war. We try very hard to make, such as the food, when I'm thinking of it, food and nutritional support. If we give nutritional support, a lot of times it's high protein biscuits for children, it's baby food. There are obviously times when we give normal, regular food for the mothers because we have to feed the mothers who are giving birth, and plus the women and the elderly need to eat. But again, we try to control for where it goes and who has that ability to get it. We do a direct handover to the person who's the recipient. We do all of our work through non-government organizations. But let me just go back to the non-food items, the NFI, for a second. This sounds like that would be probably the easiest thing. And in some ways, once it's in country, in some ways it is, but there are always a lot of controls that go around it. First, we have to order it. We're ordering in bulk. Now, if you're in America and there's a hurricane in the Southeast somewhere, food can rush in from some other places around the country. If the electricity goes out, we always see the wonderful response of public workers and electricians going down to different regions to set the electricity back up and get things going. None of that is available when I'm in these countries. Again, overlay that with the war going on. One of the critical things that I was always having to work hard with, and my team, I have to be careful. You understand, if I keep saying I don't mean me alone. The team that I was heading up was wonderful. Anyway, the team, what we would do is have to get things like air clearance to fly in supplies, road clearance. I would coordinate with our US military or the warlords. This is why I'm meeting with them. The warlords to not attack our convoys coming in. We would try to set up protections around the movement of goods. This is not easy. We have been in many, many countries where our goods get stolen, but we work very hard not to have that happen for both the protection of the people moving the materials, which are usually local people. We don't fly an American in to drive on a foreign road that doesn't speak the language. We use drivers, truck drivers, and so forth from Afghanistan who have been marginally cleared for handling things, and we hope are going to be honest. And we know that we stress with them, this food's for your families, so please, you can't be stealing it from us. But all of these goods that we try to bring in, most are not available in a country at war because they're not producing anymore. And if they're a third world country, they may not have these things anyway. So we work very hard in order to do the logistics around bringing things in and having warehouses in the country that we load up with goods. Then once they're in, we have to protect them. So we have protection that, again, our civilian protection. I do not use US military is not out there to do my job. So believe me, they're not involved with my things. They're doing their job. I'm doing it with the civilians coming that we hire in. We hire guards and we hire for warehouse management, the whole thing. It's very complex because, again, we're talking here for food and hundreds of tons of food. Blankets, I'm talking about 100,000 blankets, or kitchen sets. I mean, we're talking big numbers, so it's a lot to move these things. So those are kinds of the programs that we do. Let's go on, and maybe I can just touch on a few more to give specific examples. Okay, so we do also it's unusual, but we do emergency road repairs. Now, we don't do what we would consider in America infrastructure. We're doing, all of my programs are life-saving in nature. That has to almost be the underpinning of our programs. If I can't bring it back to life-saving, I have a hard time justifying why I spent that money to our Congress. And this money comes from your taxes and my taxes. It's appropriated to our office in Washington for emergency disaster that is separated. It is not anything to do with FEMA, which I think a lot of people are familiar with the in-country people that respond in America. We are kind of the international FEMA in a way. It's a little bit of a loose association, but it's sort of that. So we get appropriated the money. So in order for me to justify why I have spent, and I do justify every single dollar, I have to prove to them that it's really life-saving. When I'm talking emergency road repairs, it's because we're way up in remote areas or in villages in the mountains or something, and they have to have a conduit to get to market or get to the services, get to healthcare. So we try to help to provide that. Sometimes when I'm talking some of these programs, sometimes it's working a path through the mountains. It's clearing a path, it's securing it, making it level, and making sure that it's even for donkeys or for horses or for carts. The one that I talk about in the book in Afghanistan was the Salon Tunnel repairs and safety program. This was because that tunnel was a crucial conduit between the southern part of Afghanistan and the very northern part of Afghanistan. It was the tunnel through which refugees were beginning to return once America got to Afghanistan. It was the tunnel through all of our supplies had to go back and forth. So that was its use for us and for its primary use. The secondary thing was that it also was the way that the people would also personally get their own goods and supplies. And what we were having is people trying to go through an unsafe tunnel that had been bombed during their civil war. But prior to us, America didn't bomb it. Prior to us getting there, it had been bombed after the Russians left, and they had civil war in Afghanistan. So that was to open that tunnel up and to make it safe, and it was a long tunnel. Then the income generation, again, thinking in terms of life saving, we only bring income generation programs to the very, very poor in order to begin to get them back on their feet, because we all know that old saying of you can give a man a fish, but if you teach him to fish, he can eat forever, you know? And so that's kind of where that comes from, that we try to do that. And I will talk a little bit more in terms of the kinds of income generation. We hire people to provide services. The widows' bakeries were a real emotional, touching program that we had for the women that we would find after we routed out the Taliban, and it breaks my heart to see them back, but that's another story for another day. The widows' bakeries were for the widows that got stuck, that were locked in their homes and unable to get out and work and were starving. We literally found women hadn't been out of their homes, and the homes were huts in a one-room place, and they hadn't been out for maybe 2 years or something. And so unless they had good neighbors or family that could bring them food, they literally were starving, and it was very difficult. So all of these programs, as I said, are being actually physically implemented by non-government organizations. When I talk about them, there are so many of them, but to give you an example and understand what I mean, it's obviously Save the Children, maybe it's World Vision, it's CARE, it's maybe, I don't know, the Lutheran World Federation, we have Mercy Corps. So there are a lot of them, and they can either be from the United States or from Europe, but they had to have an office in the United States so that they could be, we could prove their fiduciary responsibilities. That was an important part that they had to be able to do to get the government money. So that was one of the things that we worked hard to make sure. We do a lot of work through UN agencies being something like UNICEF or the UN High Commission on Refugees. We did a lot through the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. So the American Red Cross has an international division. They very often in a country, not in all of the countries I work, but they very often have a presence. If they don't, they also do support through their international division to the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies in the country, the local ones. So we would work with them too. So those are the people that are the hands and feet for us. As we bring the money in, they're our hands and feet. Okay, next slide. All right, so then the other part of it, my personal struggles and challenges living afoot. When I live abroad, you can't think of it being a visit to Paris or a visit to London. I'm in very remote, very uncomfortable situations, depending on connectivity. Sometimes I can't talk to family or anybody for weeks at a time. And that certainly has improved with obviously the internet and the web. So that's given us a lot of help when we've been overseas. But the dissociation from families. I really had a hard time sometimes because I was alone. And when a person's alone, you sort of have to make new friends and new associations because you can't be totally isolated in whatever you're doing. So my work family very often became my primary support system. And it was a thing that ended up that I felt like sometimes they could understand me better. They certainly knew what I was living in more than my family back in the States. So that disassociation that you get, and this is very common. I think you find this for any of you who may have been in the military and been overseas, that kind of closeness that you'll get with your comrades in arms and the people who have been in the trenches with you. And that's a little bit of what goes on too with the humanitarian work. And I did struggle with that. Dealing with being alone is a bigger issue for some people than others. For me, my aloneness wasn't the issue. It was feeling that people didn't know what I was doing, where I was. But that's also this sense of isolation that you get. For me, going into the Afghan thing, I was in a really fragile mental state. I had been in job burnout. I talk about this in the beginning of the book. I was coming off of 10 years of hard work with dealing with so many tragedies. I felt like I had made the decision actually to stay in the United States. And I had made the decision to work in humanitarian work from a headquarters position where I wasn't actually looking at the trauma day in and day out. And so not seeing it helps you just take that step back and it's impersonalize some of it. But I had been in years of meeting people, talking to them who had been through horrific experiences. I had really been amazed man's inhumanity to man. I did not know how to process a lot of this, and it didn't matter what religious group it was. I obviously, I mean, I saw, Muslims being bad to Muslims or being bad to Christians, Christians being terrible to Muslims or terrible to other Christian sects. It just didn't matter where I was. I mean, it seemed like that there was so much hostility between groups. And I'm going to read a small section here a little bit in the book about kind of how that comes to be in the societies. So I was in a real burnout, and I had thought I need to step back from all of this horror for a while. And unfortunately, 9/11 happened, and it kind of thrust me back. Then we look at the safety issues. Obviously, there were personal safety issues. Now, I always tell people, if you're going to go into the bad section of any city in America, you have safety issues. Some of those are the same things that I need to be in tune with when I'm in a foreign country. I need to know what are the safe areas, what are not the safe areas. In a war zone, again, we overlay something else that we have what the military calls kinetic activity. So you've got some actual fighting going on different places. And for many people, of course, I don't pass for anything other than American or at least European. So they knew I was a foreigner, which made me a real prime target for hostage taking and kidnapping. So I always had to be very, very careful about that and be aware of what I needed to do to provide for my own safety. I was briefed at the embassy. I was briefed by security personnel, and that was a critical part of my everyday life. Everyday life is to be careful, depending on where I was located. At any moment, kidnappings can happen, and it takes 5 seconds off the side of the road to be kidnapped. So I really had a lot of training in that, but also I was always briefed on what was happening locally by our security personnel at the embassy. And then the final thing for me was finding my way back home. It's interesting, anybody might think gosh, she'll be so glad to get out of there and get home and, go get a good hamburger or something. But it's really not that easy. It's hard to walk away and you leave people you've begun to care about in the country. You leave the situation and you walk away and you're still on edge. You're still in high alert. And so finding my way back home was really a big struggle for me. How to be back with family, how to be back with people within my circle of friends who complained because the hot water heater didn't work that day, or there was a line at McDonald's and they had to wait or something. And all of those kinds of things would hit me really hard when I first came home. I think that people are beginning to recognize certainly this with our dear military people. The servicemen that come back have a lot to do to re-enter and to be back into a safe society. Well, to a maybe not equal, but to a great degree, the humanitarian workers and our diplomats overseas, very often, if they're in these hostile locations, that's a process that we also go through. So I do talk a little bit about finding my way back home in the book. Okay, next slide. Okay. Here's a picture I wanted to share with you. All right, so this is the ambassador on the left in the blue vest. And now, I didn't think about it when I was there, but you can see how much we kind of looked alike. And she was the ambassador to Pakistan. When I started working in Afghanistan, we didn't have a place to sleep in Kabul. So we started our work in Pakistan. And I was in Islamabad, and I began to get approached as if I was the ambassador in so many locations and so many situations. And it hit me that, oh my gosh, to Pakistanis who maybe have seen a grainy picture of the ambassador in the paper, they would not have seen me, but they would have seen her. And then I'm walking down the street. They think I'm her. So I was approached a lot. Now, at first it was kind of a joke, and I kind of laughed about it. My driver thought like, oh my gosh, he's being perceived as driving the ambassador around, until I reminded him that the modus operandi for kidnapping is you kill the driver and you take the person in the back seat. Now, that was me. He didn't think it was quite so funny, but we really had to set up a whole new security process for me. And I discussed this at length within the security staff at the embassy with the ambassador. I discussed it with her and I said, I'm being mistaken for you, to the point where at that time, it was a family posting. So her children were there in school in Pakistan. One of the teachers of her daughters came up to report to me about how her daughter was doing in school. I was like, wait a minute, you have to stop. I'm not who you think I am. And so at first they tend to think that you're just denying it for security, which would have been a normal thing. But I kept trying to convince people, no, I'm not her. But it was a big security issue. And I talk about that in the book. And I have some humorous things and some things that are very concerning that could happen with my being mistaken, because the ambassador in any country does not travel without being in an armored vehicle with a lot of security staff around her. I'm walking around alone most of the time when I'm off duty. When I'm on duty and I'm doing official jobs, I may have some sort of security around me as necessary. But anyway, so that's why that picture is up. That was kind of an ironic thing that we ended up looking so much alike. Next slide. Okay, so this was the first American embassy in Kabul. This is the old embassy, and it had been closed for probably, I think it was closed for 13 years or so. The last ambassador that had been there prior to us going back in 2001 and then 2002 to establish an embassy had been assassinated in Afghanistan. And so they closed the embassy in response, withdrew all of the diplomatic personnel. You can see how the doors look. It kind of is, concerning. And then that's the old building. Right now, I'm able to show this picture very comfortably because the new building is completely different and it's across the street. So normally we don't show pictures of the embassies or the doors up close like that for security reasons. But that's where I was working and running around in either the snow, because this was earlier in the year. Afghanistan and Kabul has very, very cold winters, lots of snow. And in the summer, it's very, very hot. So we go to all the extremes. But anyway, that's a peek at the embassy and the doors that I walked through every day. Stayed that way the whole time I was there. They never got them replaced because they always knew they were going to have to do something for a new building. So those are my doors that I walk through every day. Next slide. Okay, this is the grounds around the embassy. So the picture on the left, that's me in the burqa, and two of my colleagues at the embassy. One is American, one is not American. Doesn't matter which is which, one is and one isn't. And they were the staff there. So we took a picture of me in the burqa. But I have to say, I never wore that full burqa outside. We were not allowed to do so. Because if I walked outside with that burqa and say like the wind blew and it showed part of my leg or my ankle even or something, any Afghan man could come up and start beating me. So the embassy, one of our security guidelines was women do not wear full cover like that. Now, I did wear cover. I wore a hijab, which is the head cover. But my face always showed, so they knew I was a foreigner. There was no question. But that was why we never wore the full burqa like that. But anyway, picture of me in it. The slide on the right, the picture on the right, rather, the smallest trailer there is my little trailer. It's the second one from the left. We lived in those trailers after we got out of the bunker, underground bunker, because there was no room at the embassy. And I discussed this in my book quite a bit. The underground bunker is actually where you see those two square things on the top of that grassy knoll. They look like beehives or something. They're not. Those are the air vents coming out. There's a bunker underground there. And I lived underground there for the first months in Afghanistan. And then the embassy bought these trailers, just random trailers from, I think, Germany, and they got them in. And that little one was my trailer. So that's kind of some of the living arrangements. So we have to know that people tend to think of diplomats always staying in 5-star hotels. Not so for me. But anyhow, next slide. Okay, so this is again me doing out some work in the field. The one on the left is me on the presidential grounds, and you see me in the black dress there, and I'm with that. That's the U.S. military staff that's there, and they are watching the time. They are there, and we're talking about doing some coordinated programs. At this time, the military was doing a lot in conjunction with establishing the safety around the grounds of the presidential palace. So I would go and I would have meetings there. In this picture, we have a couple of Afghans that would report back, because anything I was doing was never considered classified from the country government. They needed to know what humanitarian services I was going to bring in. Now, it's not to say that some of my movement wasn't secured, because we had to protect it for that movement. But anyway, that was the meeting that we were having with US military, Canadian military, NATO, and a couple of Afghan representatives. And we were talking about how to coordinate programs so that we could make sure that as much help got out to the people as possible. The one on the picture on the right is, those are some of the protection team that go out. Those are civilian protection security personnel. They are not military. In the background, you see an Afghan who's doing some work around the sandbags, and another. We were at a military outpost, so there's an American military person. But anyway, that's how well armed they go. And I prefer not to be around quite so much weaponry, because my safety is my neutrality. My safety is that we're trying to bring food to all children. I don't ask whose side the father's on. I don't ask whose side the village is fighting for. I'm bringing it to the civilians who are caught in the middle and innocent. And this is a standard humanitarian operational posture. So anyway, these guys were there to protect me from, well, they were actually, I have to be in full disclosure, that they're really to protect the ambassador. I was traveling with him that day. So these two were actually the ambassador's protection team. And I could either get into the protection or not. It was up to me. Their eyes were always on the ambassador, not me. Okay, next slide. All right, so I said I met with warlords. So these are a couple of the warlords. On the picture on the left, the man in the blue shirt was known as the baby general, and he is an Afghan who was in the cave when Osama bin Laden was killed, was assassinated, and he was his really right-hand man at the time. He was a very young man. I talk about it fairly extensively in the book about what his background and how he became a very important leader at a very young age. So they called him the baby general. The man on the right is General Dostrom, and he was the one that's known as the Butcher of the North. And I met with him a couple of times, and he surprised me. He's the one that's also was poetic, that I was impressed that a man who could be called the Butcher of the North and did horrific battleground activities could be to some extent a Renaissance man, as he looked at what was happening in the world and his life and his village and his country. So anyway, and I do give some example of that in the book. Next slide. Okay, this is me up in the Salon Tunnel. Let me talk about this, the picture on the right. You see the big black hole there. That's the tunnel that was actually quite a nice tunnel before it got blown up. And that got blown up by the Northern Alliance prior to America getting there. But it was to keep the Taliban from coming through the tunnel and capturing the North. Unfortunately, now the Taliban are in the North. They have captured that area. But this was when I was there, and that tunnel is about maybe 2.5 kilometers long. It was horrific, and it was a real hard thing for me to go in and travel through, but I had to go through to get to the other side for a meeting with some of the warlords and the elders there. On the left, that was me in the spring when we went up. I was up in the winter, but this was a spring picture that I took. In the winter, it's all snow, and it's like being on another planet. It's unbelievable. But the man with the camel, if you think about the truck, when you do road construction in America, and they say you have the follow me truck, he was like the follow me truck there. He would come through and people would follow him one way, and then he would go through and people would follow him the other way, because you see the tunnel is not safe and it's not easy. You can't get a big truck in there, and then if it breaks down, you can't pass. And that was a lot of the issues around securing that and making that tunnel as safe as possible without going into construction of a whole new tunnel, which I did not do. But the World Bank finally did come in many years later to construct a tunnel. It was an important road. So there's that picture. But yeah, I was with the follow me camel there. Next slide. Okay, people tend to think of Afghanistan as, again, that very primitive place. It's a contradiction, it's both, it's everything. In the mountains, it's very primitive, and they're living like people lived 300 years ago. And, they certainly don't have running water or toilets, or they don't have a supermarket here or a grocery store. But the other side of the coin is this is in Mazar-e Sharif, which is probably, I think, the second or the third largest city in Afghanistan. The Blue Mosque, which was a marvel of architectural ingenuity and building, and you can see the beautiful mosaic tile work on the outside of it and on the inside too. It was one of the most important holy places for the Muslims in Islam in the world. It is the burial place of Ali, who is the nephew of Muhammad, the prophet. So this is a really important place, but the reason I am showing it is for you to know they built this in the 1500s. Think back to America, we were still in log cabins. This is in the 1500s that they built this beautiful, huge mosaic architectural marvel of a mosque. So that's why I'm showing that, to tell you that Afghanistan is a mixture. I don't want everybody to think everybody from Afghanistan is primitive and has no education. And I have a wonderful story about us going in there with the ambassador and in the book. Next slide. Okay, so this is the, I think, last slide. And the one on the right is me with the three little girls that were used to be my, I used to call them my shopping consultants downtown. And this is on what was called Chicken Street. And I don't know why it ever got that name. Maybe someday in the past it sold chickens, but anyway, everybody called it Chicken Street. So you have all these little kiosks and little shops along the way. And the little girls would just travel would walk up and down the street. They were beggars in the street, but they would walk up and down the street with me. And I would get a nod if the price was good, or a little shake of the head if the merchant was asking too much. They were just so delightful. I do write about each of them a bit in the book. The big white van that you see over in the right-hand side of that picture is my embassy car with my embassy driver. So he's parked there. I'm never sort of out roaming at this point on my own. The picture on the right is the ambassador giving me a Certificate of Achievement Award and Distinguished Award in Afghanistan for our humanitarian work. And I so enjoyed working for this ambassador. He was the perfect one at the perfect time for us under very difficult situations. And I do write about him too. Next slide, I think that's it. Yeah, okay, that's it. So listen, I would like to open it up. If there are any questions? I think we have about 10 or 15 minutes, so.
We do. I have a couple of questions, Sue, but before I do that, thank you. Your story is so personal, and you really shared the hard things about this, and I know that that's appreciated by our audience. You were going to read a short passage. Do you have that available to read? If not, we'll go ahead into our questions. You just give me a nod.
I'm sorry, say again?
You had a short passage that you were going to read from your book. And if it's available, let's do that. And then we'll move to a couple of questions.
Sure. Yes, I do have a short passage. So let me go ahead and just read this. Okay, so this is a meeting with all the different warlords that we were going to do. Okay, so it's chapter 17 in my book. The day was only half over. We still had meetings with more generals. An ethnic Taji, General Ustad Ada Mohammed Noor, and an ethnic Uzbek, General Abdul Rashid Dostrum. It was and is important to know the ethnicity of various persons in Afghanistan. This is their primary source of identity. I was always surprised by this. Historically, ethnicity seemed to mean more to the Afghans and had a rather strong influence on social strata and power. Rather than seeing each as an Afghan, they saw each other according to their ethnic background. I came to believe that this focus on ethnicity caused many of the problems between the tribes. There seemed to be a genetically derived hatred of the other, passed on from generation to generation. Everything seemed to be measured as a zero-sum game. If one group was on it, the other was not on it. I found it amazing that the Afghans seemed to rank the status of each individual according to their ethnicity and would not recognize that all people, all tribes could be good, all heritages could be rich. Instead, it was a matter of who was better than the other. Because of these sensitivities, we had to schedule separate meetings, hoping to bring the generals together later that afternoon. There was an uneasy peace between the men, born of having a common enemy, the Taliban. Both of them were rather famous or infamous, depending on one's view, for their bravery and viciousness in battle and their unwavering dictatorial command over their troops and families, both during the Soviet War and the following Civil War. They also had an unparalleled hatred of each other. The city of Mazar-e-Sharif had been split for decades between these two men, with a constant tug of war between neighborhoods and streets. I was frequently perplexed that the Afghans could express such love and loyalty to their own specific tribes while espousing a rampant hatred of the other. This same dynamic was often applied to the various Islamic religious sects. For those of us unconnected to such strong feelings, we only need to look back into our Western history to see the violent days of the Protestant Reformation period during the 16th century, when the church encouraged the killing of people who were labeled heretics. This challenge to authority in the Catholic Europe is no different than what Islam is experiencing today as it struggles with lines of authority within its faith. The Reformation suffered through 30 years' war with decades of unrest to follow. Is this a sign of what we can expect between Sunni and Shiite sects within the Islamic faith of today? Does it forebode and foretell how long America should plan to be in Afghanistan? We would never have guessed in the early 2002.
Wow, that's wonderful writing. I could listen to it all afternoon. I know you have many more stories you could share.
Yes,
we'll get to a couple of questions. One I'm just going to read and ask you, and then Charlotte, we will unmute you in just a moment. Pat Sickles wants to know what years were you there?
I was there for 2002. Now remember, we had the attack was in 9/11 on 2001. The United States government decided they would retaliate near sort of in October of 2001, and we had just a few of the sort of special forces that went in. We did not have a big military presence. I went in January of 2002, and we did not have the open embassy yet. We did not have a full diplomatic corps there yet. And it was imperative, though, for the US government. They wanted to have someone be there to start addressing humanitarian needs because they did not want it to be labeled as a war against civilians for women and children. Mm-hmm. So this was a part of my responsibility going in early. And I stayed there through August of 2002. So those were.
Well, and we were talking before the audience joined us about how it took you about 8 to 9 years to write the book. So that kind of gives us a sense of the timeline there, for sure. So Charlotte, I think Sam's going to unmute you and you can ask a question for Sue.
I just wanted to ask if you were part of AID or some other organization.
Part of AID?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. We are an office in the United States Agency for International Development. We are their disaster response office. So we are housed and we're part of the State Department in a loose arrangement between them. Yes. Good question.
Thank you, Charlotte. I appreciate that. And Sue, one more, and then we'll see. I have a couple more questions, but we'll see if we have time for one more. Many of us may feel we've experienced fear and believe that we can explain what fear feels like. How would you describe fear for the Afghanistan people?
Fear for the Afghan
people?
Yeah. There are fears generated for a couple of different things, different reasons, of course. And I think that a big part of what we're looking at for the Afghan people is there's the fear of the unknown, fear of what comes next. And certainly for the women, they have no authority. So there's a sense of helplessness that is imposed upon them because they can't do anything. So they have a lot of fear about how to just survive from day to day and who will make what decision that will impact them. And then, of course, there's the more overt fear, of course, of fear of gunfire and bombs. And there are certainly lots of horrific, and I talk a little bit in there about the different landmines that are buried in Afghanistan. So there's a fear of all that kind of activity. And for that, I mean, people can become paralyzed or they become hostile themselves and fight back. But I was more involved with sort of that fear of for being out of control. They had no say in their lives and how to do it. And for that reason, I actually never had a sense of anger for any of them. I mean, they used to ask me, how can you come here if your son got bombed in the World Trade Center? And I would always look at them and I'd say, well, did you know about that day or about that plan? And they go, I don't even know where it is. I don't know what the World Trade Center looked like. And I said, of course not. And I really used that as an example for them. I don't need to hate you because you're Afghan. You did nothing to me. And it was something to go back to that reading that I did is don't just hate people because of who you think their ethnicity or something. I'm not going to hate all of Afghans because somebody, and first of all, because it wasn't the Afghans who came to bomb. They just obviously supported the Saudis and the few other people that came over on the planes and bombed us in America. So it wasn't even them, but they really couldn't get over that I would come and help them. And then secondly, I always would tell them that the gifts weren't from me. I mean, they thank me and I say, you know, this isn't from me. You have to understand this is from the American people. And I did not say it was from the American government because it really comes from your money, your taxes. And they could relate from a people to people because they had no association with their government. So for me to say from the government and what disassociate for this is from the people, that made sense to them. Their people are people, the government's the government. And they kind of really divided it a lot. So I always would say this is from the American people. And I said, they care. They care if your children are dying, if they're hungry, and it personalized for them. And I kind of used to do that because I wanted to be witness to who Americans were there. So, but the fear is something that is prevalent in some of the women's lives every day. I mean, they were afraid of their husbands coming home and being angry, beating them up. I mean, they were afraid of everything. So there was all levels and all kinds of fear.
Well, we are fortunate that we had you over there representing us. Your kindness and your heart and the things that you brought to us today are really meaningful. So we really, really appreciate it. Your story has touched us all. And if our audience is interested in ordering Susan's book, you'll easily find it on Amazon. And the title again is Outside Heaven, an Afghanistan Experience. This hour has just flown by. I know for me, and I'm sure it has for everybody. Thank you so much. And before we say goodbye, this is the last presentation in our fall lineup, and we'll take a break for the holidays, and we'll be back on February 15th, and again in March and April. And we're working on some great topics. Can't wait to share them with you. And always, I encourage you to send in your ideas to us. We would love to hear about them. And because this is just really about open dialogue with all of us. And we're so thankful again to you, Sue. What a wonderful hour and what an incredible life.
Thank you.
What an incredible life. Thank you so much. So with that, we'll say goodbye and look forward to, as always, we'll follow up with a recording of this session, and it will also be on YouTube, and we'll send directions to you to how to find that. So thank you.
Thank you.
It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.